Welcome, everyone. I'm Becky Lau. I'm the Executive Director of Archaeology now, and really pleased to welcome you to this live YouTube event featuring the poetry of Al-Andalus, which will give you incredible background for an event that we have coming on in 2 weeks' time, featuring the poetry and music of Al-Andalus performed by an ensemble from Spain and Germany that are traveling to Houston. So thank you for joining this event. And while you're here, we would appreciate it if you would ring that bell and sign up to become a subscriber because that way you learn more about things that are coming in advance. So with all of that done, I'd like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Brown, who is from Cornell University and a scholar in Judeo-Arabic studies with a specialty in the poetry of Al-Andalus. And we are really privileged to be working with him in planning the programming that's going to take place in 2 weeks from now. So, welcome to the podium, Dr. Brun, and thank you for being with us. Sorry, one other thing to say. Anyone who wants to put comments in the chat box, you'll have a chance to get more information following the presentation when there will be a short Q&A session. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Houston Archaeology Now, Becky and Mohammed for organizing this and for working through the various tech issues. And thank you to those of us who are here live today and whoever happens to look on when we go onto YouTube in recording. So I want to just begin by acknowledging the moment that we're in, because although we're going to be talking about various things that inspire and enchant in the way of Arabic and to a slightly lesser extent, the Hebrew poetry of Al-Andalus from the Middle Ages, I'm mindful of the way in which this is connected or maybe even disconnected from the events playing out in the contemporary Middle East, in which we, the United States, have intruded ourselves and are currently enmeshed. What I'm going to present today, of course, is no panacea for these events. It's not an antidote for death and destruction, but it's a decidedly different set of human experiences that I think are much more enlightening and enthralling than the news that we receive daily. And I'll leave it at that. All too often, the Islamic world is thought of as other and as Eastern from a European, Eurocentric perspective, which includes all of the West. But as you can observe from the couple of maps that I'm going to show you, Al-Andalus, which is also called Islamic Spain, not only resides in the West, it's farther west if you have a look at it than London, England, but it also inhabits the European continent. So this binary worldview of Islam as the East and Arabic culture and literature as something other is very misplaced, particularly when we talk about the Middle Ages and Al-Andalus. This afternoon, I would like to introduce you to this literature, the Andalusi Arabic literary imagination, and the exquisite beauty of its poetry through reading a few short paradigmatic lyrics, along with two Arabic-style Andalusi Hebrew poems. In each instance, I hope to show you, the poet's literary venture was informed by what's been called the Arabo-Islamic cultural ideal of beauty as a rule of life. All of God's creative handiwork, its infinite splendor, and its perfection could be admired and relished, and its many pleasures enjoyed within the limits set by God's own holy law. Arabic and Hebrew literary intellectuals avidly cultivated a finely tuned aesthetic sensibility and intellectual regimen because they held that a divine purpose endowed human beings, all of us, each and every one of us, with a rational mind, and that through the exercise of this faculty, it was possible to better know God through creation itself. The quest for knowledge and the capacity to appreciate beauty were thus central to both religious devotion and to cultural production. In particular, Islamic civilization, including its Andalusi Arabic branch, was in awe of the elegance of the word, of attractive and stylish speech, the practice of writing itself, as we hear in an exquisite two-liner from the poet Ali ibn Musa ibn Sa'id. Through this poem's double personification, a distinctively human activity is naturalized, and the uncanny beauty of inscribing, sorry, of inscribing, there we are, the Andalusi garden, inscribing transfixes nature itself. And when Andalusi poets talk about nature, this is what they're actually talking about. It sounds like the like, but they're talking about what we have to think about when we listen to this poem. The river is like a piece of parchment on which the breeze is tracing its lines. And when they see how beautiful the writing is, the branches bend down to read it. The following epigram by the 11th century Andalusi Hebrew poet Samuel ibn Nagrila captures the centrality of the scribal arts and learning to Andalusi society and culture in a different way. Man's wisdom is in what he writes, good sense at the end of his pen, and using his pen, he can climb to the heights of the scepter in the hand of the king. Now that we've spoken briefly of the poet's appreciation for the splendor of the world and the power of the word, let's turn to the cultural construction of love, or more accurately, desire. In the following lyric, Abu Ishaq ibn Khafaja, who is from Valencia, died in 1139. He's known as Al-Jannan, the gardener, for his signature floral and garden poetry. This poem measures a startling equilibrium between two ostensibly opposite human impulses, pious devotion to God and the religion of love. As you listen to me recite the poem in translation, notice how the paradox and conflict are established in essentially prosaic language, intensified by antithetical conceptual parallelism in each half of verses 1, 2, and 3, and compounded by the synonymous conceptual parallelism between these same lines. They're all saying a different version of the same thing. The keenly calibrated tension these first three lines creates is then released by the transformative metaphor of the final line, in which nature literally holds sway over the poet at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Yet one moment, I turn to God in atonement. The other moment, I'm a lover. I weep for my sins, and I mourn for love. I cry when fear of God engulfs me, and when the moment comes, I pluck the fruits of passion, as if I'm the pliant branch of a bond tree, bent by the north wind, this way and that. The poetry of desire can surface in surprising ways, and as in the following poem by Ibn Malik of Murcia from the 12th century. I saw in the Friday mosque a slender youth like the rising moon. Whoever sees him bow in prayer says, all my desires are in his prostration as he bows. Notice here the intrusion again of the profane into sacred space, and yet there's a certain innocence to the poet's gaze. Certainly his thoughts devoted to God's service are diverted to something beautiful and desirable in his mind's eye. but that is as far as it goes. Furthermore, the poet utilizes a rhetorical gambit familiar in Arabic poetry, as it were, to justify his gaze. We're told that anyone who sees this sight, anyone's desires would succumb to such a vision of beauty. Ambiguities and ambivalences pervade the literary record left by two of the sterling poets of the 11th century, the male Ibn Zaydun and Princess Walada, renowned Andalusi poets and aristocratic paramours whose story functioned as a kind of cultural trope akin to Caesar and Cleopatra, Romeo and Juliet, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. I realize I'm dating all of us somewhat, but I'm going a little further. King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, the Houstonian Beyonce and Jay-Z, to bring it down to our world, or Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski. The Arabic literary imagination and life as it is lived cross paths in Ibn Zaydun and Walada. Their exchange of poems includes some very sharp retorts from the female latter, in which she vents her frustration and impatience with and disdain for her on again, off again lover. Lesser known than Ibn Zaydun and Walada, but no less interesting, are another pair of star-crossed poets from noble families of 12th century Granada, Hafsa, who died in 1191, and Abu Ja'far, who died in 1163. My purpose here requires me to set aside too much historical considerations in favor of literary historical and critical concerns. But I think I know you as an audience well enough to offer you a few scant biographical details you will undoubtedly crave in listening to the poems. Abu Ja'far's teachers are said to include Ibn Khafaja, the gardener, the brilliant poet from Valencia, whose lyrics we read a moment ago. Like many poets, Abu Ja'far served as an important court secretary to the governor of Almohad, Granada. Just imagine if the elites of Washington, D.C. were to follow the example of Al-Andalus. Vice President Vance and Secretary of War Hegseth would be poets, and I'm pretty sure the world would be a much better place. Unfortunately for Abu Ja'far, his powerful boss also fell in love with Hafsa, and our poet's position in the ensuing love triangle seems to have forced him to flee Granada. Abu Ja'far joined a rebellion against Almohad rule in Al-Andalus, but eventually was apprehended and executed in 1165. For her part, Hafsa was brought to Marrakesh, Morocco, by the Almohad Caliph to tutor his daughters. So much for the bibliography, and now on to the poetry. Here are Abu Ja'far's lyrics. May God preserve that nighttime free of blamers, which secretly concealed us in Hawr Mu'ammal. A fragrance drifted in from Najd, and when it spread, wafted was the scent of clove. The turtle dove was singing in the tree, and the sweet myrtle branches bent low over the stream. The garden was delighted with all that it could see, hugging and embracing and kissing lips. On the face of it, we have a four-line poem employing many thematic elements familiar from the Arabic literary tradition. We are given a voyeur's glimpse of a secret evening tryst between lover and beloved, held in the most idyllic of settings, a lush enclosed Andalusi garden. Even the love lyrics stock figure of the spying censor is present here, ironically, by mention of this figure's fortunate absence. No one is watching them. They're free to do as they wish. Invoking God's power, the poet reconstructs the magical moment himself through the resource of his memory and his apparent skill with the Arabic language. Like the rendezvous itself, the representation of what transpired is oh so discreet. The ambiance and the moment completely overshadow the barely inscribed human personae. Only the single direct object suffix, concealed us, alludes to the hidden presence of lover and beloved in person in the poem. Contrast this extreme restraint and circumlocution with the other poet I mentioned, Ibn Zaydun's famous Nunniya to Walada, in which the end rhyme of each lyric's ode's 52 verses offers an acoustic echo of us, 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 us. Every one of the lines of that poem ends with us. Here we have one us, that's it. Whereby, in that poem, the anguished poet attempts to recapture in language an intimacy that's lost in life. Note back in our poem, the gallery of sensual pleasures in Abu Ja'far's lyric. It's detached from anything human and it's displaced onto the natural realm. As usual, there is an abundant fragrance in the air, the sight of the myrtle, the rushing sound of the fountain's water and accompaniment of the melodious bird, and finally, undifferentiated touching. More significant still, the lyric's affective response to the setting and the interlude is transferred from the poet and his female companion onto the garden and its songbird. It's as though the garden and the songbird and everything there um, are approving observers and almost nearly participants in this joyous moment. The turtle dove croons, and the garden is delighted with all it could see. Yet even here, what the garden sees is rendered abstractly with a series of verbal nouns undifferentiated by subject markers of any reference to human participants, hugging and embracing and kissing lips. Of course, we can read the assemblage here of natural elements, especially the garden, as more than atmosphere, but as a symbolic representation of human figures obscured from our view. We should not neglect to mention the culturally specific geographic markers of the first two verses. This requires a little expertise. The only signs of specificity in a poem otherwise set in a perfect archetypical Andalusi garden. Hawar Mu'ammil and Najd are famous places of recreation in Islamic Granada. The latter's named place, Najd, also suggestive of the sacred home of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, such elusive references underscore the nostalgic tone of the poem as a whole and resonate with a cluster of love and longing motifs long established in Arabic poetry. As much as they adored Al-Andalus, Andalusi poets were not averse to casting their mind's eye eastward for a source of inspiration and at times cultural competition. In any case, these two geographic markers are the only signs in this lyric pointing to experience as it specifically lived rather than as poets imagine it in verse. The poem thus rests entirely upon artful rendering of elements in a paradigmatic Andalusi urban setting. With the social encounter between the two figures obscured from view and only implied, the poem appears to paint a scene of perfect natural harmony and uncommon beauty. Abu Ja'far's poem is a work of pure convention, and yet it's unduly optimistic for a love lyric. It celebrates a supposedly blissful rendezvous with the poet's beloved and memorializes it in verse. However, the etiquette of Arabic courtly love poetry, as in the medieval romance lyric, usually requires that the beloved, female or it could be a young male, be utterly cruel and the lover completely frustrated in his quest for love. That is not the case here in our poem. The paradox is that love is a love of the obstacle, which forever thwarts love. To put it another way, the poet can demonstrate conventionally that he's truly a lover only if his anguish is absolute and he's prepared to sacrifice everything for love. Typically, the love poem is a dramatic monologue in which the poet-lover addresses an inaccessible, absent, departed, or silent woman for whom he longs. The poet's stance may be that of an observer, but his posture is more frequently petitionary. He implores the beloved to listen, to respond to his increasingly desperate advances, and he pleads that she stop victimizing him with her unresponsive yet irresistible charms. To persuade us that the beloved is captivating, the poet typically also offers flattering, although usually stark descriptions of her incomparable beauty. And he tells us that his sleeplessness, his copious tears, and his psychosomatic agonizing pain, so like in our world, stomach aches and palpitations and missing a heartbeat. The beloved, however, never accedes to the poet's pleadings, leaving him frustrated and anguished beyond measure, a hopeless poet and a forlorn lover. That's the norm. By contrast, Abu Ja'far does not suffer for love, and the beloved does not rebuff his advances in our text. Rather, the portrait, if we can call it that, is a pair of lovers enjoying the harmony of togetherness in perfect and approving surroundings. The petitionary element is lacking, as is any description of the beloved's physical beauty or emotional characteristics. That is, the conventional affect is transformed from frustration and suffering to the joy that accompanies complete fulfillment of togetherness. The poet thus constructs a mood, setting, and personae at variance with Arabic poetic tradition, and he does no better in representing his beloved, about whom nothing is said at all. When we read conventional courtly lyrics, the reader must take care not to be misled by a figure of a woman seemingly so empowered as to hold the poet's life in the balance. She is almost always a woman as men would imagine her, an ideal and objectified figure whose frequent appearances in love poetry underscores the fact that most real women were denied a prominent public voice in Andalusi society. Yet, that is not to say that Andalusi Muslim women were silent all the time or in its literature. On the contrary, we know of some 40 female poets whose work is represented in Andalusi letters. Arguably, the most important Andalusi woman poet, Hafsa, is the author of 18 poems that have come down to us. The immediate purpose of Andalusi poetry is to entertain, to persuade, to ritually celebrate the aesthetic values of its audience of like-minded Arabic literary intellectuals. How, we might wonder, did its addressee read the first poem? In Al-Andalus, the answer to such a question frequently comes in the form of another lyric, an epistolary lyric sent back to the person who initiated the exchange of poems. In this case, it represents a biting refutation from Hafsa to Abu Ja'far. She answered, saying, "By my life, the garden took no delight in our union, but rather showed us rancor and envy. And the river didn't applaud in joy at our closeness, nor did the turtle dove sing, except of its own ardor. Don't think so well of everything, as you are apt to do. It isn't justified in every circumstance. I don't believe the horizon showed us its star unless it was in order to spy on us." This rejoinder is crafted in the same meter. This is the norm in an exchange of lyrics, set by the first person, although there is in a different end rhyme. It also neatly follows the canons of Arabic rhetoric by engaging the first writer, the first scripter, and his lyric in a counter exercise on the same theme, using and negating or qualifying many of the same images and conceptual elements employed in the first poem. Indeed, in the classical age of Islam, poems of debate and rhymed prose debates were a favored enterprise of the learned classes, who really enjoyed the intellectual stimulation and the aesthetic pleasure of clashing opposing points of view with counterpoint against point. The second poet lays out a different and overtly personal perspective, which was absent in the first poem, signaled by her opening outburst, "By my life." Recall that Abu Ja'far's poem concludes by observing, with self-evident justification and satisfaction, the gardens delight with the pair's encounter. Hafsa counters this all too rosy picture from her male lover or would-be lover with the opposite assertion and reinscribes herself into the lyric in the first and subsequently second person address from the get-go. By my life, the garden took no pleasure in our union, but rather showed us rancor and envy. The poet turns her companion's words back on him, stylistically as well as conceptually. The second lyric foregrounds the presence of an unidentified us and turns it into an opposition of I and you. The two are no longer hidden and implied subjects, but direct objects, us, of the garden's manifest malice. The garden is joined by the star in the final line, thus assuming the conventional role of the watcher, the spy, the slanderer, the raqib in Arabic poetry, whose purpose in the love poem is to represent the social voice of conventional morality and to help subvert the poet's quest for love. What was secretly concealed from view in the first poem is revealed in the second, and in a harsh light to boot. The second line proceeds to reverse two of the remaining affective perceptions established in the first poem. She said, and the river didn't applaud in joy at our closeness, nor did the turtle dove sing except of its own ardor. He had said, the turtle dove was singing in the tree, and the sweet myrtle's branches bent low over the stream. The river and the turtle dove were indeed present on the scene, as they frequently are in a love lyric, but not in the way the male poet lover imagines. The water's rustle and the songbird's crooning have nothing to do with the lover and the beloved in Hafsa's poem. Nature is thus portrayed as either hostile to the couple or altogether indifferent to their would-be assignation. It is as detached and disconnected from them here as it was symbiotically at one with them previously in Abu Ja'far's poem. Go back to it so that you can have a look at just how much she's turning everything back on him. Also, nature is doing the same. Arguably, the most stinging reverse and rebuke comes in the third line. It scolds the poet lover for his self-satisfaction, an attitude said to be characteristic of him, and not merely a response to a moment he misconstrued as wonderful. Don't think so well of everything as you are apt to do. It isn't justified in every circumstance. But the criticism of the lover's perception and self-absorption does not end here. Abu Ja'far's poem permitted no blamers, no spies, no one to disrupt the proceedings, did not mention the stars that by convention watch over the evening meeting of lover and beloved. Hafsa restores both motifs in her poetic rejoinder, consistent with its inversion of the garden's elements. Abu Ja'far's certainty that all is well is matched by her assurance that the thrill is gone, and that the watching star was in fact a spy out to ruin the evening. Measure for measure, Abu Ja'far's comeuppance is complete. Ironically, from the perspective of the Arabic literary tradition, the female poet in the second poem plays the conventional role of the beloved to near perfection, except that she speaks, albeit in castigating tones and manner. To put it another way, she refuses to play the role of the mute, if arresting beauty, and she takes control of the process by which the male poet typically enacts his desire through language. In assuming this role, she not only voices her own perspective, but she also casts her companion's character against his will, as it were, as a proper lover who suffers for love. By thoroughly rejecting her lover's perspective and his posture, if not the lover himself, her poetic variations on conventional themes that he introduces invert and thus subvert the male poet's recollection of the evening and the rendering of it in his lyric. Against the backgrounds of the conventions of love in poetry, it is as though Hafsa must herself tutor Abu Ja'far in how to compose a more correct love poem. As we have seen, she does so by enlisting the metaphorical language of the garden and its elements to voice her annoyance with her poet lover. Whereas the garden and its harmony envelop the couple protectively and approvingly in the first poem, its sounds and sensibility turn, uh, turn decidedly inhospitable and hostile in the second. The harmony of the enclosed space is shattered. We might say that the garden joins the female poet in speaking up against the male would-be lover. This rhetorical maneuver appears cleverer still when we realize that the garden conventionally evokes comparisons with the beloved's body. Her breasts typically are spoken to be like ripe fruit, her figure resembles a slender bough, and so forth. Hafsa's poem thus offers a singular form of literary criticism directed against her counterpart. Abu Ja'far stands accused of being a poor lover. It seems to have been good for him, but it surely wasn't good for her. But worse still is that Hafsa's lyric accuses Abu Ja'far of misrepresenting himself, of misrepresenting her, the beloved, and misrepresenting their encounter against the conventions of the lyric. He is thus deemed a dreadful poet. In Andalusi cultural terms, this is arguably the one fate far worse than rejection or even death. Let's now turn to a discerning and artistically crafted illustration of a meditative, reflective poetry in the form of Samuel ibn Nagrila's Arabic-style Hebrew lyric. It's almost existential in its perspective on life. Be glad, she said, that God has given you 50 years in this world. Though she didn't know. There's no division between as I see it, my days that have passed and Noah's of which I've heard. In the world, I have nothing but the hour I'm in, which stands for a moment and then, like a cloud, moves on. Consider that the female voice which opens this poem with birthday greetings for the poet. There is no dialogue here, but we, the audience, are vouchsafed the dismissive poet's response. She didn't know. As far as the aged poet's concerned, remember, he's writing in the 11th century. There is no difference between his 50 years of life and the biblical figure Noah's lifespan. For those of you who have forgotten scripture, it's 950 years. So in effect, he's saying 50, 950, what difference does it make? His retort for us reminds us of the brevity of what remains of his life. The poem's sole figurative gesture is held off till the very end of the poem in the form of a cloud moving on. What are properties of a cloud to which he compares the hour in which he's in? The illusion of substance, the reality of moving on into dissipation. The how of this little poem is even greater, more brilliant than the what. Follow the waning trajectory of the units of time it mentions, from the first verse down to its last. Years, days, hour, moment. It poetically captures the theme without our even noticing when we first encounter the poem. It's only appropriate that we end with something a little more optimistic and joyous, an epigram by our ill-fated poet Abu Ja'far, an invitation to a wine song, and here it is. Bring on the wine! Meeting it is happiness, and the only sadness is prolonged separation from it. The pitcher weeps when it departs, and the cup's mouth laughs on meeting it. Here are some things for further reading. I'm also happy to respond to any questions you might have or any emails that you might want to send me. There's my information. Becky, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions people might have, and I'll also put us back in that Andalusi garden.
Oh, thank you so much. And oh my goodness, the garden is beautiful. Oh, how stunning.
So
Well,
notice the trees always around the flowing water basin. That's the image that they are talking about, as if it's set in the countryside, but it's always an urban garden, and typically with fragrant orange or lemon trees and birds singing in the branches of the trees.
well, actually, you just provided the first lead in for the first question. How much of the garden was idealized, do you think? Or was this a very real sort of garden that one would encounter?
Both. Great question. So hopefully, Archaeology Now Houston is inviting you to southern Spain. And if you go to the older sections of Cordoba or Sevilla or Granada in particular, but even some of the smaller towns, you will see gates on small cobbled streets, and very often the door to the after the gate will be open, or there'll be no conventional door that we would expect, and you will look in on an inner garden courtyard. This is a fairly fancy one here. So this was both a social practice, a place where people would congregate, would talk about poetry, would talk about religion, would listen to music, would talk about gossip in the neighborhood, political gossip in the country, whatever news there were to be shared, just as we do. And because of climate, this is something that it might work well, not today, according to Becky's report about the weather in Houston, and only a couple of the seasons of the year here in Ithaca, New York. But this is obviously to be enjoyed outdoors, where this gathering takes place. So it's both real, but of course, in the poetry, it does serve as an idyllic setting in which nothing nothing can go awry. Although Hafsa has her way with that idol.
Well, I'm so glad that you introduced Hafsa again because I'm also thinking about this how this poetry might reflect on social ideals from the time. Obviously, it sounds like women are and men are mixing, that women are not sequestered as much as happened later. And I'm also wondering how this poetry perhaps depicts the roles of women. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Right. So women, it's really complex, and scholars have worked a lot on this. Poetry is poetry. It's not entirely a mirror of life. And Hafsa and Walada, the two female poets I mentioned, who are really, really well known and who are also brilliant poets, this is a poetry for and by the educated elite. So we're talking about class differences when we talk about the world of poetry. It's not to say that people of other classes don't enjoy listening to poetry in the marketplace, or listening to poetry. A certain style of poetry would be the poems that we read in translation are all recited. But there's another kind of branch of Andalusi poetry in particular that's sung to musical accompaniment called the muwashah, a girdle poem. And these might be played in other kinds of social settings for people's enjoyment, popular song, as it were. But in the main, um, when we're talking about women participating, we're talking about educated and upper class women, and not really other women in society who have a much more restricted, regardless of their religion, place in that society. Um, some rights, some guarantees, but also different kinds of responsibilities and probably less of an education. So it's quite complex, and people study this. But the poetry, with the exception of what we get from the female poets, who are letting their male counterparts have it. They are modern women in that respect, and they're not afraid of any consequences. They all, have agency. And so today, in our world, I think we're especially drawn to this voice
Mhm.
because we see very powerful, highly educated women taking on men and saying, "No, it wasn't like that. It didn't work for me. I'm going in a different direction." Um, I hope that answers the question.
Sure. The other thing that comes to mind is, would this have been the sort of evening, uh, maybe similar to a salon where people are gathering specifically to hear poetry, drink some wine, hear some music? Um, is this the sort of atmosphere that one would have experienced?
Outside of the lovers' tryst, yes, exactly.
Yes.
That's what yeah.
Yeah.
And it could be, as I said, these are educated people, people of means, people who are enjoying pleasure. Not every wine poem in Arabic is reflective of a wine drinking experience. It's a mistake to say, oh, this is not Greenwich Village in the 1960s. These are not bohemians. They are literary bohemians in that they are crossing boundaries, but as poets always tell people who want to come and criticize them, I'm just writing poetry. This is not, there is a wonderful poem by Ibn Rashid from Kairouan where he talks about a blissful evening where he and his companion ran out of sins to commit. But I thought about including it, but he's from North Africa, so I left it out. Um,
Oh,
uh,
you should
uh,
have.
um, you know, it's tongue in cheek. It's like I'm going to have some fun and pleasure with the poetry. I'll make this very, very beautiful and titillating.
Mhm.
And he can always say, all I did was write a poem. I didn't. That's not anything that happened. Um, so on the
Well,
Hebrew side, we have very pious Jews, very learned, some even rabbinic scholars who are writing about, being attracted to male beauty and, kissing their male
mhm,
beloveds.
mhm,
And there's an exceptional, it's a poem that's also meant to be set to musical accompaniment, in which not a rabbi per se, but a very learned, these are completely observant, today we would call them Orthodox, but everybody is observant back in this world. And he writes about grabbing the breast and thigh of these beauties that he's surrounded with. This is not it's a reflection of cultivating a sensibility, an aesthetic sensibility, not necessarily or even remotely an experience. And the poets certainly understood this. Some very conservative religious figures in society didn't always like that idea or go along
mhm,
with it. And
mhm.
they have their say as well. But poets always are able to stand behind, I'm only a poet. I just wrote a beautiful poem.
It's all for art.
Right.
How much do you think that this poetry is reflecting? You just mentioned something about a poet that you omitted that was from Northern Africa, but of course, Northern Africa is in Spain, and so is the rest of the Mediterranean world. So, how much of this poetry is reflecting more broadly?
Like this. Okay. So the Andalusi
Hmm.
poets are reading everything that's being written in North Africa. They're avid consumers of poetry from the East. They see themselves in a bit of competition from the East. Eastern Arabic poets are very dismissive of those people in the West. They don't know poetry, they just copy what we wrote. Um, And but they're all in the business of using language to enhance beautiful images and imagined or real experiences.
Right.
And it's one cultural universe. So even though, your program at Archaeology now in Houston is focused on Al-Andalus, it could just as easily have been about North Africa or the Islamic
Hmm.
East. It just as easily could have been about that.
Well, I do have to say that on the evening that we present poetry, two of the musicians are from Morocco, and they
So
will,
they know Andalusi musical and poetic tradition. So
yes.
it's because particularly in the 14th century, and then after uh, Islam as a polity ceased to be in Iberia in 1492, and then the expulsion of Granadan Muslims in 1499, people who did not convert. All of Andalusi cultural and musical traditions went to Morocco. It already was
Oh
in
my
concert with
goodness.
Morocco, but
Yeah.
quite literally, when people went into exile from Al-Andalus, they brought with that tradition to Morocco. And the Jews who began their exile from Al-Andalus or from Christian Spain as well, brought their very much Arabic and Islamic inspired traditions from 1391 at the beginning of their catastrophe
Hmm.
or the whole next century to 1492. Some of them went to Amsterdam, others went to England, others went to Italy, many went to the Ottoman Empire, but many also went to Morocco and it reestablished their communities there. So if you go, I'm leading an adult study tour to Morocco in December, and when you go to a place like Fez, you'll see something that's called the Andalusi Quarter. Now, today, I think probably some people who trace their ancestry back to Al-Andalus are there, but these were parts of, Islamic cities like Fez in Morocco, where an Andalusi presence was, very, very strong at a particular time.
Right. You just keep providing these setups for the next question that I had in mind. I don't, you're uncanny in the way you're doing this.
No other from people who are online.
Well, there's one other question. I'm thinking about the courtly love poetry of Europe that happened later in time, and I'm wondering how much of the poetry from Al-Andalus influenced the love poetry of Europe, which has sort of had not existed earlier.
Correct.
So, was this influence from Al-Andalus impactful on European poetry?
There's a big debate among scholars. The more conservative scholars, the more Eurocentric scholars find evidence and want to argue, and it's very intricate series of arguments, but want to argue that no, there is no, you use the word influence, I would just say common, common threads or something like that. Um, so they want to argue that way. More, let's say, more not conservative or progressive minded scholars see the opposite. So I want to reference my dear, dear colleague who's has not been with us for quite some time now. Maria Menokal
Yes.
wrote a very, very important book about this, in which he tried to
Mhm.
lay out the arguments that the European love lyric, not just troubadour, but the European love lyric in particular, was entirely dependent upon or derived from Andalusi lyric tradition.
Yes.
She makes a very
Yes.
strong case for that. And her picture, and this was written for people like people who are connected to archaeology now. It's
Mhm.
for the educated reading public, the museum going public, the concert going public.
Mhm.
Her wonderful book, The Ornament of the World, which was completed really on the eve of 9/11. And then she had time to write a new either postscript or introduction. I don't remember. This sort of also makes that case in a more accessible way. So I want to send people to that book. And she has plenty of poetry from all of the languages in this book in translation.
Yeah, this is a wonderful book. It was one of the inspirations for us whenever we sat down and started planning the season. So I'm so thrilled that you included it. Um, well, it's been a delightful afternoon with you, and sort of helped us whet our appetites for what's to come in the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
My pleasure. And to everyone who sees this, don't miss the rest of these programs that Archaeology Now has arranged for you. Take advantage of these cultural experiences. They're marvelous and they really expand our horizons.
Thank you. Especially in this day and time, particularly in the last couple of weeks, this is
Amen.
needed more than ever. So
Amen.
thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Be at Temple Emmanuel on Wednesday, the 25th, where you will hear performers from across Houston uh, presenting some of these pieces. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye bye, everyone.